My name is Lee and welcome to this video tutorial. In this video, we're going to continue from our previous video where we looked at logical operators. However, previously we looked at logical operators to compare whether or not a value is true or false. But whenever we're building games, most of the time we want to check, for example, floats or integers. That it becomes very useful to us, for example, if we want to check the status of, let's say, the health of a character, or whether or not we want to make the difficulty in the game increase. So let's look at how we can do that. Well, to do that, we need to use a new type of operator called equality and inequality operators. If you remember your math class, you'll know that equality and inequality operators are as follows. We have greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and finally equals. So these are the basic operators that we're going to look at in this video. The first one, greater than, says that if it checks, should I say, whether or not value A is greater than value B. The second one, greater than or equal to, checks whether or not value A is greater than or is equal to value B. The third one checks whether or not value A is less than value B. The fourth one checks whether or not value A is less than or equal to value B. And finally, the equals checks whether or not two values are equal to each other. So that's basically what these nodes do. They're pretty easy and very straightforward to understand. But let's look at how we can use them to build some basic logic. What we're going to do is we're going to create an enemy and we're going to create a threshold. The enemy is going to represent the amount of enemies that we currently have within our game. And if there's less enemies than a certain threshold, we're going to add more enemies into the game. So how do we do that? Well, we need a variable. We need two variables to be exact. Variable number one, we're going to call enemies. Variable number two, we're going to call thresh for threshold, and press enter. We need to change the types here from Boolean to float because we want to have a float value. And then we're going to compile. Now we're going to bring the enemies into the graph and we're going to choose get. And we're going to choose and bring the threshold and choose get. So now what we want to do is we want to set the amount of enemies we currently have. I'm going to say in this example 10. And we want the threshold to be, let's say, 15. Meaning that if the amount of enemies, in this case 10, is less than the threshold, 15, then we're going to add more enemies. To do that, we can use the less than. Actually, we can use the less than or equal to, depending on what you want to do, whether or not you want to make the actual threshold the minimum, or if you want to make it just below. If you want it to be below the minimum, for example, if you want it to be below 15, then you would use less than. But if you want it to be 15 or less than 15, then you'd want to use the less than or equal to. But in this, I'm going to just use the less than. So I'm going to paste this over here. And we're going to say that if the enemies is less than the threshold, then we want to do something. Well, what do we want to do? We want to increase the amount of enemies we have. So we're going to drag an execution pin from the event begin play and type in branch. So now this is our condition. In our previous video, we learned how we can set a condition for a branch. So here the amount of enemies, if the amount of enemies is less than the threshold, this is the condition. And if that is true, then in this case, we're just going to print. I'm going to use a print string. And we're going to say add 10 enemies. We can, if we like, increase the duration that we would see this on the screen, perhaps 10 seconds. And let's change this to a color that's perhaps a little easier to see. Now if we compile this and we run our game, we'll notice here in the top left it says that we have added 10 enemies. The reason for that is because the amount of enemies that we currently have, which is 10, is less than the threshold. However, if I were to go back to my graph here, and I was to select the enemies, and I were to increase this to, let's say, 20, and we were to compile and execute this, you see that now we do not get any message. And the reason for that is the amount of enemies that we currently have is greater than the threshold. We can see this, if we want, by making a copy of the print string, pasting this, putting this in the false, and say, no need to add enemies, and compile and execute. And here you can see no need to add enemies. So that's the basics of using equality and inequality operators. You can see here that we can use them to compare different types of values. We can, for example, compare integer values if we want to too, or we could perhaps compare whether or not something is active or inactive. So that's the basics of using equality and inequality operators. We can use them to compare two values, whether or not they're integers, floats, or anything else. I, at this point, would, suggest that you explore and use these different operators and see what they do and see what kind of logic you can build. Until then, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. Until next time, bye-bye for now.